our time today. Thanks everybody for joining. Oh, you don't want to see my playlist there. All right. The slide doesn't want to advance. Here we go. There we go. Yeah, so today is our 8th workshop session. This one is on our reimbursement boot camp. And it's led today by Patty Telgener from Pinpoint Access. So just a little background on Patty before I turn it over to her. So Patty is the president and CEO of Pinpoint Access Consultants, where she leverages her extensive experience as a clinician, a reimbursement specialist, and a certified medical coder to provide specialized consulting services to both early and established medical device diagnostics and pharmaceutical companies, with a proven track record, including the successful exit of her first company, Canary Insights. Patty has guided numerous companies through complex product launches, FDA approvals, securing insurance coverage, ensuring that innovative technologies reach patients who need them. So her client list includes industry giants like Alphabet, Boston Scientific, and Medtronic, where she played a key role in making groundbreaking products accessible, from continuous glucose monitors to digital prescription therapeutics. Beyond her professional achievements, Patty is an active advisor to nonprofit healthcare organizations such as the Association of Diabetes Care and Education Specialists, serves on boards and working groups, contributing her expertise to advance patient care and access. In her remaining time, she's deeply committed to her community through volunteer work as a coin-appointed special advocate for children in need, which I thought was pretty cool. So Patty will be leading our session today. When Patty's kind of wrapped up, we're going to do the breakout on kind of what's needed and what's next, and I'll come back and set the stage on that. We're going to have Tim do a brief review of mentors, advisors, and boards, and then we'll talk a bit about our deliverables and wrap up for today. So just again, our Zoom suggestions, use your mute feature when you're listening, come off mute to ask a question or enter it into chat. I'll help monitor the chat box for Patty. She'll stop and pause for questions, watch the chat window for comments, questions and answers. Keep your video live if you can, as a courtesy to Patty. And if you're having trouble with drop-offs or freeze frames, then turn off your email and shut off the camera. That often can help. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Patty to introduce our reimbursement bootcamp.
Awesome. Thank you, Kevin, for that nice introduction. Let me just get my PowerPoint up. Okay. And Kevin, is everybody able to see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So with Kevin's explanation of my background, it makes me feel very old. And I like to say the whole reimbursement process for device diagnostics has changed so much. Like I remember back in the days when I was an ER nurse, and at that time, all the medical supplies had their own little charge sticker on it. So you'd go and we'd have, trauma coming in, and I'd have stickers on my scrubs, and I'd go home with probably, $1,500 on my scrubs. And I'd be like, oh, I saved some lives. I don't care. And now that I'm now on the business side of things, you really realize, just how important the whole reimbursement is. Like in that case, to that hospital, if I went home with a charge sticker, they were not able to pay for it. So we are going to cover today kind of at a high level reimbursement. I realize this group comes from a lot of different viewpoints, different industries, different stages of development. Some of you may have already thought through your reimbursement. Some may be like, what is reimbursement? All of that is fair game for today. So please, as Kevin said, ask your questions. The more interactive this is, just the more everyone will gain and the more fun it will be. So for our agenda, so the first like about 45 minutes will be didactic. We're going to go through the PowerPoint. I'm going to walk you through kind of coding, coverage, payment. We're going to take a little break, and then we're going to come back and have a short breakout with your groups on really kind of putting some of the things that we discussed into your real life. Come back, share some learnings, and take some Q&A. Okay? Any questions from anybody before we start? And Kevin, I don't have the chat up. When I find myself presenting, I get easily distracted. So I'll count on you to just stop me at any time.
Yeah, we'll do.
Okay. So if there's one, I have about 3 key takeaways that you're going to hear over and over. The first one is start early. Think about reimbursement, start planning, regardless whether you're still on your initial clinical phase or whether you're getting closer to having some discussions with the FDA. It is never too early to start thinking and planning for reimbursement and starting to develop, and you're going to hear me say this over and over, what's your value proposition? Why does reimbursement matter? Not so much anymore, but I would say about 10 years ago, I would have to fight with CEOs as to why reimbursement is important. They're always focused on product development. They want to have the best patents. They want to have the best, legal team and product development. And I would say at the end of the day, reimbursement needs to be one of your top considerations. Because at some point in your product life cycle, it will be impacted by reimbursement. Whether that's you coming to market, whether you trying to sell your company, whether you're trying to get investor funding, they're going to ask these questions. How are you going to get paid? And what's your value proposition? We all realize healthcare costs continue to rise. So payers, everyone is getting very, I would say, tight and more cost conscious. And then on the other hand, we see hospitals and physicians really getting pressure and really feeling the pinch on reimbursement. So before, when they used to be much more open on new technology and cost may have come in the discussion after clinical value, what you may find now, cost and reimbursement are right up there prior to getting your product into a hospital, into a physician's office, etc. We're going to talk a lot about integration. So reimbursement needs to be part of your regulatory, part of your clinical, part of your marketing strategies. In the end, they all have to be aligned. And I will kind of walk you through some scenarios on things that have worked well and some that have not. Bottom line, if there is no reimbursement, you're going to have challenges to market access. Show me the money. Bottom line. Okay. So when you are just starting to think about reimbursement, when you are just starting your product design, you really need to start thinking about reimbursement. Start thinking, what is going to be our clinical value? What are we trying to bring to market? An example here is if you are durable medical equipment, for example. In order to have Medicare coverage, you have to have an expected life of 3 years, of durability of 3 years. When I talk to companies, I can't tell you the number of companies that had to go back to the drawing board and try to meet that requirement in order for them to be considered DME, durable medical equipment. That's just one example of really understanding how is your product design. I work with a lot of smart engineers. And I always tell them, just because you can develop something doesn't mean you should, and doesn't mean it's going to get paid. Setting of care, very important. If you're pharma, where's that going to be distributed? Are you going to be an inpatient procedure? Are you outpatient? Are you physician office? Each of those reimbursement pathways are completely different. So you really need to understand your site of care. And sometimes that site of care can change. Like I work with companies and they thought they were going to be inpatient. And we walk through that reimbursement and I'm like, you got more options as an outpatient. Can you change your product? Can you change your standard of care and have outpatient be your primary site of service? Provider type. Who's going to use your product? Who's going to prescribe it? I like to say there is a very clear food chain within the provider type. So if you have a product that is going to be used by a cardiologist, cardiac surgeon, neurosurgeon, you may find that when it comes time for CPT codes, which I'll cover later, you're going to have a lot more clout than you working with family practice or physician assistants. Again, not one right or wrong, but you need to understand who is going to be using, who's going to be prescribing your product. Clinical indications. Can't state this enough. Define your subset of patients. Most likely, you're not going to cure all cancers. So find those patients that you bring the best value, and that will help you with your coverage and payment. And I'm going to give you some examples of that. So I highly recommend everyone kind of take a step back, and I call do a reimbursement landscape. Sometimes that can be done internally. Sometimes you may need to use a consultant. But what that involves is looking at coverage, coding, payment, and competitive landscape. And I have heard so many times we don't have competitors. This truly is a disruptive technology. And I tell them, unless you have discovered a new disease, you have competitors, because maybe there is no treatment today, but that's a competitor. And the payers have not been paying for treatment. So everyone has a competitor, and really you need to understand what are the current coverage decisions. And you may be a new product, disruptive technology, but still need to understand how has payers looked at this technology. And if you're walking in to a landscape where payers have typically not covered this space, you have a little higher road ahead of you. Coding. You may be a Me Too product and you think you're going to come on the road with, coding, coverage, and payment in place. That may be true, or you may be just different enough that payers aren't going to consider you a Me Too, even though the FDA gave you a 510K. Last bullet point here, investors. I spend a lot of my time on calls, not only with companies, but with investors. And I kind of told Kevin in the past that sometimes I feel like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth. In the morning, I may be representing an investor, and I would be on the phone challenging each of you on what's your reimbursement strategy? Have you thought about it? The other times I'm representing the company. But I will tell you that, and I tell investors all the time, do not be afraid of new disruptive technology. And what that means is there most likely are not codes, coverage, payment established. And that's okay, in my opinion. And I tell investors that. The question is, does the company realize it? And do they have a plan in place? Because new technology can and will get covered, but you have to have a plan. And I have told many investors to walk away from companies that have not developed their reimbursement strategy. trying to keep, and I will keep this reimbursement high level, and you're going to hear a lot of probably new terminology. And I don't expect you to walk away and say, oh, I really understand each of these. The slides will be available to you, but I do want you to at least hear some of this terminology and then come back for either more information if you need it at a later time. So reimbursement, to me, very simply, I break it down into 3 components: coverage, coding, and payment. They all need to be incorporated into your strategy.
Hey, Patty?
Yes.
Yeah, we have a couple folks online there. Your audio is kind of going in and out a little bit.
Huh.
Yeah, just so you're aware, the volume seems to keep going up and down. So
All right, maybe move it a little, and I did just turn it up. Okay, is that better, Kevin?
right now, yeah, that's
Okay.
great.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, please let me know. You can have coding, but not coverage or payment. You need all 3, but each of them operate, frankly, very independently. And I'm going to walk you through. How do you know if you have existing codes?
I got your office, Angel.
I don't think that was me, Kevin. I can give you examples where we had a company that got new codes and great payment, but the insurance companies wouldn't cover it. We've had good coverage and no coding. We've had coding and coverage and low payment. So really, all 3 of these interact and are essential to your reimbursement strategy. Kevin, how's my volume? Is that better?
Still a little bit jumping in and out, but
That's interesting.
can hear you just get very soft.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know. I have good internet here. Okay, so codes. First question, are there existing codes that you can use? And you may ask, are there codes that you want to use? Because there may be a code that is out there, but it may not pay at the level that you need it to pay. So early on is the time to have that discussion, not once you're getting ready to come to market. Understand, is there coverage? What kind of data will be required? And payment, all of these components and questions and answers should be included in your reimbursement strategy. Because if you know you have codes and the payment does not work for you, you need to be proactive. So when we talk about coverage and we talk about payers, who are we talking about? We're talking about the government, and that can be Medicare, Medicaid, VA. Commercial, that can be national or regional payers. We're seeing more and more employers become the payer. They're taking on the risk. They're making coverage decisions for their employees. And also here, the patients. The patients are becoming more and more of a decision maker on their care. They have high deductible plans and they're making decisions. So the largest payer is Medicare. In order to be eligible for Medicare, you need to be 65 years and older. Kevin, I'm going to go off video and just see if that helps.
Okay.
I don't know if, in order to be eligible for Medicare, you need to be either 65 years and older, disabled, or individuals with end-stage renal disease. The national offices in Baltimore, regional offices located throughout the country. And you may have a product that's in the pediatric space. You'll say, you know what, I don't really have or need Medicare coverage. And I will tell you, Medicare is used as a benchmark decision for all payers. So you need to at least have Medicare in your plan, in your vision, and your strategy. Important to know that Medicare has budget neutrality. So every year, as new technologies come on, Medicare needs to maintain budget neutrality. And a big thing that we saw here with the new Alzheimer's medication, you know, the premiums actually went up for the beneficiaries, and Medicare said it was directly due to some of those new medication at a very high cost. Commercial payers, you're seeing, you know, this can be a lot of different things. It can be a managed care organization. It can be an accountable care organization. They make their own decisions. So if you have Aetna coverage, that doesn't get you Cigna, that doesn't get you Blue Cross Blue Shield. So when you're looking at coverage, it is a large manpower requirement because you need to go to each of the payers. Doctors can be in network or out of network, and that is a key differentiating thing, especially now with the new plans, that if a patient goes to an out of network doctor, sometimes they have no coverage or they are responsible for the majority of that care. Employers, do not underestimate employers. And when technology first comes to the market, I encourage them to really go talk to the large employers. Sometimes that's easier to get into than to get Aetna or Cigna or United Healthcare write you a policy. Kind of an overlap between commercial and Medicare are the kind of the Advantage plans. They call them Part D. I think the statistics for 2025 are going to be over 60% of Medicare beneficiaries are choosing Medicare Advantage plans. So what does that mean? To me, that means that companies need to have a foot in both space. They need to understand Medicare and they need to understand the commercial. Because how that works is Advantage Medicare plans have to cover what Medicare covers under the fee-for-service. If Medicare does not cover it, Advantage plans can then default to their commercial coverage. Like, for example, Cigna, United Healthcare, one of the biggest Advantage plans deliverables. They may say Medicare doesn't cover it, so I'm not going to follow my commercial coverage for my Medicare Advantage. Can be good or bad, but you as the company or the drug, the pharma company, you need to understand where they stand on your coverage.
Hey, Patty,
Yes.
we have a question back on Medicare. And it's I don't understand the Medicare bullet point pay at cost to achieve budget neutrality. That doesn't mean they require zero profit for the seller, right?
No, very good question. Not at all. That has nothing to do with the company or the device diagnostic pharma's profitability at all. It has to do with the Medicare budget. And a good example of that is, let's just take the physician fee schedule. So every year, Medicare has a budget. And you will see that they actually this year had a 3.2% reduction across the board. And that is due to the budget neutrality. But no, I will get to where the payers establish payment. But in this discussion, it has nothing to do with budget neutrality from the company's perspective. So thank you for asking that. Coverage. A lot of people think it's all or none. Either they're going to cover my drug, my device, my digital app for everything or not. And that's not true. It can be favorable, it can be unfavorable, or limited in nature. And what I strongly encourage is understand these 4 questions. Is it medically reasonable and necessary? You can have FDA approval. That does not mean that it's reasonable and necessary. That means that it is safe and it does what it says it's going to do. Does it diagnose or treat a medical condition? Third is the most important. Does it impact net health outcomes? I can't tell you the number of times I worked with technology, and especially now with a lot of the genetic testing. That space gives a lot of great information. The payer's going to say, does it change outcomes? And just because you know you may be at risk for XYZ, what does that do to outcomes? Does that change the treatment pattern? And in many times it does, but not always. So just be aware. They're going to say, not just that you have good data, does it change outcomes? And when you go for coverage, I really always strongly encourage, go with the subset of patients that aligns with your data. And a good space for this is diabetes. I work with some products and their FDA labeling is for patients with diabetes. So that could be type 1, type 2, gestational. But the data they have is for type 1. So I tell them, go for coverage for type 1. It's easier to expand that door and go to type 2. But if you go in and you say, I want coverage for all patients with diabetes, you could end up with a non-coverage. And that is a lot harder to overcome. In the end, coverage is driven by clinical evidence. My first takeaway for you is start early. My second takeaway is spend the money on the clinical evidence. If you don't, you will be doing catch-up once you hit the market. Cannot state that enough. The clinical evidence is going to be needed. It doesn't matter, and a lot of times, and we're going to cover when you are going through the FDA, start thinking about coverage. That data may not be needed for the FDA, but you most likely are not going to be able to afford to come back and do a second study. Okay, we're going to cover that in more detail. Takeaway, you need clinical data. When we talk about Medicare coverage, you have really two options. One is what they call a national coverage decision, an NCD. This is at a national level. If you get a positive coverage, it is a huge win because all Medicare beneficiaries now has coverage. I will tell you, it's risky. And I have probably taken a company, again, new to market, and suggested going for a national coverage decision probably twice in my 30 years. Because if you get a negative, you are out of the Medicare market. Okay? I'm going to walk you through the other option on the next slide. National coverage decisions, really, they have to have enough market impact that you have Medicare's attention. And we saw this with the new Alzheimer's medications. Medicare knew that they needed to kind of get behind this, and they took that to a national level. Again, you may say, I'm not going to pursue the Medicare market. I'm telling you, you need to understand the Medicare market, because if Medicare comes out and writes a non-coverage, which I've seen them do for a pediatric product, and then the commercial payers use that. They're like, well, Medicare, didn't cover this. And I would be like, of course they don't cover it. It's for pediatrics. But the fact that they took the time to write a coverage decision, Medicare non-coverage impacted this. If you go for a national coverage decision or you have a consultant recommending that you do, make sure you have all of your ducks aligned. There are some new ways with CMS and the FDA now working together for new technologies that you can go to the FDA and go under the new coverage for evidence or for new technology, and you can come to the market if you have breakthrough status with CMS saying that we will cover you for the first 4 years. And not going to cover that in a lot of detail today, but just know if you do get breakthrough status at the FDA, there are some options for you to partner with CMS pre-FDA approval. Otherwise, you cannot get coverage decisions, whether it's Medicare, Medicaid, private, commercial, until you have FDA approval. They are not going to cover a non-FDA approved product or service. Okay, so really the most typical when you're looking at, all right, how do we get Medicare coverage? And that is to go what they call at the local level, LCD. There's currently 9, what they call MACs, Medicare Administrative Contractors. All of the states are divided into those 9, and they make decisions for their own state. So in this case, and you see it all the time, you may have coverage in California, but you have a non-coverage in Florida. Same thing, New York may cover it, the Midwest may not. It is easier to work with the local MAC contractors than at the national level. Be aware, you can request coverage from Medicare, or a physician can, or a society can, or a competitor can. CMS does have to put all of their coverage decisions in the public domain, and there's always an open comment period. But you need to be watching these decisions because, like I said, a competitor could have put in a request, and if you're not aware of that and you don't provide comments, you won't be part of that process. Criteria impacting coverage. FDA approved.
Patty,
Yes.
we have another question. Why will one region accept it and one not? Is it based on different health demographics?
Very good question. And I would be very wealthy if I knew that answer. It is inconsistent. It is not necessarily logical. What I do find is there are MACs, Medicare Administrative Contractors, who are willing to take a lead on new technology, and there are others that will not lead, especially if they have gotten burned in the past. So they will wait until the other MACs write coverage. Another thing that I see is, what about your key opinion leaders? Like if all of your main, I'm just gonna say maybe it's a surgical procedure. If all of your key opinion leaders are in New York or the Midwest, and you go down to Florida or California, they're like, you know what? I'm not hearing anything. I'm not hearing from my physicians. I'm not hearing from my beneficiaries. I'm not going to worry about this until I see it. So Kevin, those can be some of the, some of the reasons that we see inconsistencies. And health demographics can play, but for the most part, not really. Like for, diabetes and some other diseases are more prevalent in some states, but I don't see that being the primary reason. I think it really comes down to the contractor. Those contracts are up, I believe, every 3 years. So sometimes if their contract is up for renewal, they're not going to take any risk. And a lot of times, the consultants know, all right, like I have a clear pathway of who I start with from a MAC and who is my last person to contact. Okay, so criteria. So FDA approval.
Hey, Patty, we have three other questions.
Oh, awesome. Awesome. No, please.
So the second one's from Dieter, and he's like, does Medicare consider in any way whether a new therapy reduces overall healthcare costs for patient, example, by making certain follow-up treatments unnecessary?
Great question. By law, Medicare cannot take cost into the coverage decision. But I will tell you, it is the elephant in the room every time. But let's just say that you had a new technology that truly reduced cost. Medicare could not make a coverage decision strictly on that. They still need to check all the boxes and make sure that you have the clinical outcomes. But I will tell you, and it's with Medicare and with commercial payers, taking costs out of the health system does matter. And it is important, but it's not enough. And I will also say with some of the new technologies, especially moving to like minimally invasive procedures, everyone's like, we reduce costs, we should get paid more. That's not always how it works. If you have a device, a surgery, a procedure that takes OR time from 2 hours down to 1 hour, probably that 1 hour procedure is going to get paid less. So yes, taking costs out of the system is very important. Just know that Medicare by law cannot make coverage decisions on cost. That's very different in the UK when they do with the NICE, and you know, sometimes they have to meet a cost criteria in order to get coverage. The fourth bullet point here on kind of criteria impacting coverage must be better than or equal to the current standard of care. You may be new, you may be disruptive, so you may not be held to this bar. But if you have clear competitors on the market, you must be better or equal. And if you want a higher price, you darn well better be better. If you're equal and you want a higher price, it's going to be a challenge. You're going to need peer-reviewed U.S. journal data. CMS, which is Medicare, and the AMA, American Medical Association, has gotten a little better about taking outside U.S. data. And I will tell you, when you come to, and I'm going to walk you through it, the American Medical Association CPT panel, they're going to want U.S. data. They're going to want it peer-reviewed, and they're going to want it published. I will tell you, when you have a study and then you close it out and you do a publication on those results, and then you have a longitudinal study where you're going to follow them for the next 12 months, that's good long-term data, but many times they're going to consider that to be the same patients, and that's not necessarily two different studies. Okay.
A few more questions, Patty.
Perfect. Okay.
Is it easy to replicate applications state to state?
Yes, for the most part, yes. Yeah, the same data is typically submitted. Sometimes the process can be a little different. Some will meet with you personally, others won't. I always encourage to try to get a meeting face to face. So yeah, so I think once you have what I call your technology packet together for Medicare, I would say the Medicare, that process, the data submitted is pretty consistent. In the commercial world, sometimes that data is different than what you would submit to Medicare.
Yeah. And another question is, does getting NCD automatically cover LCD?
Yes. National coverage decisions will mandate that all of the local contractors cover it. Now, mind you, if there's a negative national coverage decisions, the local contractors cannot overturn that.
Another question is this required data from your thing or from a prior device, for instance, that does similar things?
It's got to be your device. If you're
Yeah.
asking for your coverage, It's got to be your device. Now, I say that like I do a lot of work in the diabetes space. So an example here is with continuous glucose monitoring. So there's a lot of data out there on what's called CGM. But I'm now working with a company that has an implantable CGM. They need their own data that their implantable CGM works, it's safe, it has the sensitivity and all that. Now, they may not have to prove CGM is good for patients with diabetes because there's a lot of data already out there, but they still need to have their own studies specific to their device.
Can you bill for one code while you are building evidence, then submit for a new code once the studies are complete?
So I'm going to cover the codes in a little bit. So let's come back to that. And Kevin, if I forget to answer that, yeah, but let's cover that. So I'm going to wrap up here kind of with the coverage. Okay. Very point. You need to work with your marketing and you need to work with your clinical team on what are your statements, what are you saying you do, and what patients are you indicated for. I will tell you, Medicare and payers go out to your website. And you have an example that you have a device for patients with fatty liver. And you're sitting, and that's what your website says. And you're sitting in front of the payer and you're like, you know what? We need to be a screening tool for hepatitis C. And they're like, no, you're not. That's not even part of your indications. And if your marketing team wants to come out and say that you reduce surgical time, you reduce infection, you better have the data to support that. Second bullet point here, if you want Medicare coverage, you have to have Medicare patients in your trial. Everybody likes to have very specific inclusions and exclusions to make sure that they meet their endpoint. But if you exclude all patients with cardiac disease, diabetes, when you go for coverage, those patients are going to be excluded. So just keep that in mind, that payers, Medicare and commercial, look at the patient's inclusion and exclusion for your study criteria. FDA approval is necessary, does not get you coverage, does not get you codes, does not get you payment. I say it's your ticket to the dance, does not get you a dance partner. So you really need to make sure that you are planning ahead of time. Because I can't tell you the number of companies that I've got brought in at different stages. And I'll give you some of those examples. And unless you only want to navigate existing coverage criteria, if you really want to change it, you've got to get involved early. You have to understand what you're facing. This is pretty straightforward. Coverage decisions will impact your revenue. It just will. There are some products that are complete cash pay. And you know what? That can work well, especially in some of the cosmetic. But coverage will be important. Build it and they will pay. That is no longer the case. I'm also seeing a lot where in the past, your studies could just show superiority over a placebo or standard therapy. But you know what? Now I have seen payers say, we want those studies to be compared to competitive therapies. Another example in the diabetes space, advanced featured insulin pump or the artificial intelligent pump. They need to be compared. They used to be able to just say I'm better than MDI, multiple daily injections. That's not the case. Same thing for a lot of the genetic testing, a lot of the pharma. You're seeing an increase in registries tracking outcome. And CMS, Medicare, has moved to kind of what they call coverage with evidence development. And that's their way to kind of, I like to say, put one toe in the coverage. So you have coverage, but only for patients that are in a clinical registry. Now, mind you, these are for products that have FDA approval. They're not in clinical trials, but they are still mandating they will only cover those that are in a clinical registry so that they can track ongoing safety and improvement in outcomes. Okay, so we're moving on to coding. Any questions, Kevin?
We've one more. It says if you're awaiting FDA clearance, but you can't do studies on your device until then, are you going without payment and coverage all the while you are doing clinical studies?
Well, I mean, you can do clinical studies. I mean, majority of clinical studies, I shouldn't say majority. A lot of clinical studies are done to get FDA approval or FDA clearance. And in this case, I think that it's FDA clearance, so you may be submitting data based on a comparative product, but you absolutely can and should be starting to do clinical studies prior to FDA approval. Now, you need to have those studies approved by the FDA. You can't just go out and test patients without having that criteria. Now, unless you are truly a Me Too product, like you're really just the same and you went under the 510K and you want the same price, you may be able to get on the market. But if you want a higher price, you're different. You need data. Coding. Doesn't matter if you're drug, whether you're digital, whether you're AI, surgical, coding is going to be important. You saw my three-legged stool coding coverage payment. I will tell you, to me, coverage is the number one. Because if a payer wants to cover you, they can figure out coding and they can figure out payment. If they don't want to cover you, it doesn't matter if you have a code in payment. Okay, but coding is important. It will be used whether you're a drug, you're going to need a J code. Whether you're a physician use product, you need a CPT code. Inpatient, you need an ICD-10 code. All of the site of services require codes. And when I talk about that reimbursement landscape, this is where you need somebody that understands coding, looks at all the codes and says, this may be pertinent to you, it may not, but you need to start understanding. Word of wisdom, codes are not determined in the boardroom. I can give numerous examples of CEOs telling me, I want to use this code, Patty. It pays well. And I'm like, that's awesome. That's not your code. You can't use that code. It doesn't work. It doesn't meet your descriptor. The resources are not the same. So you need to validate the codes. A consultant, I like to say, can get you to the place where you know what codes are out there and can give you an opinion on if that code is correct. But I cannot guarantee you that that code is correct. The validation comes through the American Medical Association. It comes through the specialty societies. And then payers and Medicare can say, I want to use this code. But for the most part, the specialty societies or the AMA really can tell you, is that code correct? Staying under the radar is not a long-term strategy. It's not. Just saying, hey, we're going to start out with a code, and then we're going to go for our own code, which I think was one of the questions a little while ago, Kevin. It doesn't work that way. Unless you're using an unlisted code while you're getting your new code. But if you have a code that has been validated and describes your service, most likely down the road, unless that technology completely changes, you're not going to meet the new criteria to get a new code. Three kind of main areas of coding. And this could be a full day seminar on how to get new codes. That's not our thing today. CPT codes. So CPT codes are used for physician payment, hospital outpatient, surgical centers, digital apps for the most part, not really pharma and not really lab. Well, and some of the lab have their CPT codes too. American Medical Association controls that process. It is brutal. I will tell you that. It takes an average of 18 to 24 months after FDA approval. It is a political process. You have to have physician specialty support. There is a way, so there's different levels of CPT codes. I kind of call it the major baseball league and the minor. The major, which you want to be in, is a category 1. Maybe your 5-digit, you probably like 99213, an E&M code. That's a category 1. There now is a process to get what they call a category 3 code. It's still controlled through the American Medical Association, but the criteria is a lot less.
Pull up the new building.
And you can actually get a category 3 code before FDA approval. So again, throwing out some terminology, just say, all right, I understand Patty said Cat 3 before FDA approval. Does that make sense? Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. The biggest difference is category 1 codes, once you get them, for the most part, payers have to say they won't cover them, but you have a decent chance of getting coverage with the category 1. Category 3, you're coming out of the park with an assumption that you have non-coverage and you have to overturn it. But again, I work with a lot of companies. They got good data. You can get a category 3 code paid. All right, if you are in the durable medical supply or pharma, you're going to need a HCPCS code. Medicare controls the HCPCS process. It is still political, but much, much less than the CPT through the AMA. Companies can apply for a HCPCS code and be successful. Very few times have I seen a company lead the request for a CPT code and be successful. Minimum 18 to 24 month lag. I'm working with a company right now that we are applying in September here. So we're September 2024. We're going to present to the AMA February 2025. It's going to be effective January 2027. And that's assuming that we're successful and don't need to come back, because that could put us into a year later. That is, again, why understanding if you need a new CPT code and putting these timelines in place.
Patty, we have one question. Who should apply then, if not the company?
The specialty society. You got to, if you're in spine, you have to have the spine, the specialty society. And I say it's not, as I will say, on behalf of a company submitted and we were successful, but I had all of the specialty society support. And before we even started that negotiation, I asked each of those specialty societies to stand up in front of the AMA and say that we approved XYZ company to submit this and we support the application. But do not ever submit an application and surprise a specialty society. I'll ruin the ending. It won't go well. Very political. And these meetings are open to the public. And if I am working with a company that really needs a new CPT code, I will encourage, mandate that I take that CEO and their top executives to a meeting prior to our submission so that they understand the process. Payment. Okay, so payment, you may have the physician component, you may have the hospital, you may be a DME or device. This is what it feels like. If you're sitting here with a hospital provider, we pay you not. You never know sometimes. So payment, when you're talking to a hospital or a physician, that payment that they receive may be a payment from the insurance company, and it probably includes a payment from the patient. And more patients are in high deductible plans. There are plans that patient is responsible for the first $5,000. In that case, your decision maker is the patient. Sometimes it takes a lot of education because a patient may think, or a physician may think, that this service product's not covered. I'm like, it is covered, but the patient has a $5,000 deductible. So yes, that patient has to pay out of pocket, but that service is paid. So again, another takeaway, do not underestimate the patient in their decision-making. And that comes back to the employer. That employer is also a big decision maker. When looking at payment, if you have existing codes, you need to understand, is that payment adequate? And if not, what are we going to do about it? There are ways, like in an inpatient service, that you can apply for an INTAP and get additional payment. There's ways on the outpatient side that, I'm working with today, that the supply cost has more than doubled for this device. So we are now negotiating with Medicare to get into a different higher paying category. Again, it's existing technology. The supply cost has doubled due to the longevity of life. So we'll see. But again, planning, you got to make sure you understand. And you have to have good clinical data if you're asking for more money. Everyone is always focused on, all right, how much will I get paid? Or how much will the physician or hospital get paid when they do XYZ? And depending, for the most part, that's an important question. But part of your value proposition also comes down to secondary endpoints on what else do you do to improve clinical outcomes. So if you reduce length of stay, return to activities of daily living sooner, less OR time, reduction in pain meds, less time in the hospital, all of those things are very important. And you may have a product that's, let's just say it's inpatient use, that you may not get separate payment. The hospital knows that. It's going to be part of the DRG. And that's okay. But then your value proposition better be, how do you take cost out of that system? So the hospital says, I'm going to pay X for your product, but if I can get the patient to go home a day or two earlier, that's profitable for me. Reimbursement and regulatory have to be aligned. Your 510(k) clearance may be the quickest and most affordable way to enter the market, but substantially equivalent means substantially equivalent payment. And it can make it much more difficult to get unique coding or coverage. Not saying that 510(k) is not the right way to go, but you need to be aware of that. Or if you are doing a 510(k) and you want more money, you better have data. And I know you can get to 510(k) without a lot of the same data than a PMA or otherwise, but that does not mean that that payer is not going to ask you for that data to get coverage. Integration is important because most likely you can't afford to do an FDA study and a payer study. So gather as much data as you can. Like, for example, I was working with a stroke device company, and the FDA did not require like where the patient was discharged and how long those patients stayed using their device versus other treatment. But they tracked it, and with their device, patients were going home and not to a skilled nursing facility. Huge story for payers. They would never have been able to afford to do that as a separate study. Again, I realize budgets are tight. These are more points for consideration as to, can you include some of these data points? Because if you have to start over, you know it's another 18 to 24 months to do another study, get the results, and get publication. Off-label use really is not allowed anymore. You know, we used to be able to have FDA approval and you kind of wink at the physician, and physician would do whatever he or she thought was appropriate. That's really, we're seeing less and less of that. You're going to want professional societies to support your technology. You're going to need data, and you're going to have to align your coverage request with your FDA labeling. Bring the team together and do it early. Good example, marketing wants to say it's faster and less expensive. Well, how are you going to prove that? You can't just make that statement. I also say, be very careful of what you put on your website. So if you say this is a 5-minute procedure, it's less expensive, it's faster, the American Medical Association, Medicare, payers are going to your website. I can give you a lot of examples. During a CPT panel meeting, this company's saying that it's a 45-minute procedure. One of the panel members says, I'm on your website. You're saying it's less than 10 minutes on your website. So everything needs to be aligned. And faster, less expensive, decreased length of stay. Those are not just statements. They're not marketing statements. You need to have the data to prove it.
Hey, Patty, a couple questions. If a new mechanism invented for a specific specialty for a particular data-driven screening of disease with data-driven decision virtually for physician needs to go through validation from physicians first, is the validation path to such tech? Does that make sense?
Not exactly. Let me just see if I can open up that question.
Yeah, Sushasna, do you want to come off mute and ask it?
Yeah, I heard screening, and that kind of gets my little hair on the back of my neck up. But
yeah, so we have locked the IP for particular virtual diagnostic and screening methodology. So for this particular IP, do we how can we prove the validation? Is it like, because it's physician driven, physician motivated? I mean, physicians are going to use it. So is it that we have to go to physicians to get this approved and do some studies? So would our path for validation be physicians itself, and the specialty is orthopedics?
so I'm not quite sure. So is your question on clinical data, or I thought I heard IP, intellectual property?
Yeah. So it's data-driven decision making.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for clinical data.
And so more under AI. Would you consider yourself under AI?
We do. It's AI enabled. I mean, it would make the tech more powerful, but it's not like it's source and completely based on AI from inception.
So let me cover that in a minute. One of my examples is in AI technology. And the different, okay.
And Patty, one more quick question.
Uh-huh.
What is the alternative then 510K for med device? Do you mean PMA?
PMA would mean, but PMA means that there's not a comparative device on the market. And again, if you can do a 510K, that will be your quickest, most cost-effective approach. You just need to know, make sure you have your data aligned. Yeah, I mean, PMAs are much longer process, much harder to get through, a lot more data requirements. So again, just really understanding when you're developing your regulatory strategy, what makes sense. And then again, we're not going through a lot of the breakthrough designation, but if you truly have, and the word I use is disruptive technology, part of that strategy should be, what else can we do when we request FDA approval? Clinical trials. This is primarily under the PMA route, but if you have, especially like a surgical procedure, there are ways that you can possibly get that clinical trial pre-FDA covered by Medicare or commercial payers. Again, just write this down. It's a Category B IDE status. So that means that you are new, so you need a PMA, but that space of technology has been proven safe. And it does involve a lot of work, but you can go in and you can work with Medicare and some commercial payers and have that study covered, which can certainly help with your R&D cost. Has to be done preemptively. You can't kind of get in the middle of it and then say, oh, now I want to get coverage. Sometimes getting coverage can slow the study down because you need to make sure the patients are eligible, make sure they have coverage. So some companies are like, you know what, I don't want to take any risk to slow the study, but just know there are possibly some options. Metrics are changing. You no longer just increase revenue or decrease cost. So any of the accountable care organizations, Medicare Advantage plans, they are paid under performance measurements. It used to be kind of the carrot. So if you wanted to achieve these performance metrics, you got a bonus. It is now more the stick. And if a hospital does not meet these metrics, they lose. Today, it's about 2% of their overall Medicare revenue. That's huge. So some of the space, if you're in congestive heart failure or orthopedic or some of the cardiac, just one example is Medicare will no longer pay for a second admission for the same underlying indication within 30 days. Okay. So if you have a product, you have something that can keep patients out of the hospital, you're not a revenue generator, you're decreasing cost because that hospital is not going to get paid if that patient goes back. And that's where you're seeing a lot of remote monitoring in patients' home, etc. So again, big picture, you can't just look at revenue, you got to look at your total value proposition. Value proposition, I will tell you, a lot of times you have multiple ROIs. When you're selling to a hospital, your ROI may be what they're going to make and what the costs are to do that procedure. When you're talking to a physician, you're going to show what that physician, he or she, is going to make. To a payer, you may be talking about the cost savings. And it really can be that different. I'll tell you some funny stories where we had a sales rep, take the hospital and physician ROI to the payer about how much they're going to pay. Like it's targeted to your audience. That did not go so well. Integrate marketing to create that message. So we've got a couple case studies, and then we'll take some questions, Kevin, and then we'll just talk about time. And if we have time for a group breakout, if people have just more questions, we can do that route too. So I have kind of 4 case examples. This was the one for the ischemic stroke that I talked about. They had nobody doing reimbursement. CEO of sales and marketing was doing reimbursement. Their plan was to use existing codes. Nothing had been verified. So when I got brought in, I'm like, this isn't going to work. Like, these codes are not appropriate. So the CEO was not the favorite person. And I'm like, that's fine. You can hire a new consultant. Maybe they'll tell you. Anyway, we went through the verification process. Sure enough, they were not valid. Luckily, we were still enough time that we had a plan. In this case, they needed an inpatient ICD-10 procedure code. So we were able to get that. We were able to collect reimbursement data. They did get their data, their clinical study covered, as I talked about under the category B, IDE. We also collected hospital economic data. So their clinical sites agreed to share economic data. So by the time they got FDA approval, we could go to Medicare and say, this is what this procedure cost. This is the DRG that we need to be under. And here is our ICD-10 code. And they were ready to go. That would have been very different had they kept their head in the sand, and they would have had to start over if they hadn't done that pre-work. And this was also the example when they collected discharge data, like, did the patient go home? And that probably turned out to be one of their biggest, most important value statement, is that patients are going home, not to skilled nursing. Digital apps. You know what? This is progressing. Let me just put it that way. Worked for the digital app company that was for substance abuse and depression. It was approved by the FDA as software as a medical device. So I think everyone, if you're in this space, you know that that is actually a new category to be covered by Medicare. You do need to, like, your apps still need to meet some kind of FDA approval. This one was as a software as a medical device. We did get HCPCS codes for this digital app. In the long run, they did not go well. They were not well funded. The difficulty getting coverage. And the real reason is it didn't fit into a Medicare benefit category. And what does that mean? Medicare today, and they are trying to change, but today you need to either be a hospital service, physician service, durable medical equipment, or a prosthetic. To be DME, you heard me say you need to have a 3-year durability. A digital app does not have 3-year durability. So at the end of the day, Medicare said, I may think you're a great product, but you don't fit into a Medicare benefit category. So they, in this case, they went through the pharmacy route, which worked a little bit. Anyway, digital apps, if you're in that space, you still need the clinical data. There are starting to be CPT codes and HCPCS codes for digital apps. But if you are an app that you're going to put on someone's watch, most likely, that may be difficult to get covered. So either your app is considered a device, but you need to start thinking that through. And I would say in the last 2 years, this space has really improved. Still a challenge. But again, the CPT just came out with some new codes, etc. This was an example where I got a call early on, which was great. They were focusing on type 2. This was at the time a disposable product. Coming back to that Medicare benefit category. I'm like, you're not going to have coverage. You need to have a component that has a 3-year life if you're going to be durable medical equipment. And they went back to the product design, and they were able to then develop their reimbursement strategy, come in this case, under existing codes and payment. Okay, so here, and this isn't using a specific example, but this kind of comes back to how payers in the AMA coding panel is kind of looking at artificial intelligence. So different categories. And the different categories kind of differentiates how much, I'm just going to say, work is the AI doing and how much work is the physician doing. If it is a product that under the assistive, you know, I'm seeing payers pretty open to that because that physician is still doing diagnosis and management, requires an interpretation and report. I am finding these kind of going through coverage and coding pretty smooth. Now you get into augmentative, still requires physician interpretation and report. It does analyze the data. So again, we're seeing payers and the coding committee be open to this, but it may, I will just tell you, pay less because the AI is doing some of the analysis. And then we get to autonomous. Again, we're seeing some CPT codes come out. But when it does no longer require physician or qualified healthcare professional interpretation, it's just different when they establish payment because there's not a physician work component. Again, this is a space just like digital apps that is evolving. Lots of progress within the last 18, 24 months from a coverage and a coding perspective. Okay, so kind of a summary, and then Kevin, let's take questions. And I believe we have about 40, let's see how much time, so yeah. How much time do we have left, Kevin? So it's.
Yeah, don't pay attention to my agenda. I just noticed my math was wrong. So
Okay, so I'm like, well, oh my God.
Yeah, we can take questions and then we'll do a break for about 10 minutes. And then you'll still have time after that. So
okay, perfect. Just quick summary. Does reimbursement matter? Yes. Whether you're trying to sell your product before it ever comes to market, whether you're planning to take it to market, sometime it will be impacted by reimbursement. Well-designed reimbursement strategy early on is extremely important. Bottom line, if there's no reimbursement, it's going to be difficult to gain traction in the market. Okay. So that's kind of the end of the PowerPoint, Kevin. Do we have questions?
yeah, we have a couple questions. One is, does not software diagnostic prognostic in clinical use also need a new CPT code?
Say that again. Does
It's the way it's written is does not software parentheses diagnostic comma prognostic in clinical use also need a new CPT code?
most likely it's going to need a CPT code without understanding the technology. I can't say it needs a new one, because there may be one out there. And as we talked about, there's a lot of companies going for the category 3. So you need to be aware. So you may have a competitor that went the category 3 route, which is a little harder to find in the market because it's not in the CPT book, etc. But most likely, yes. But is it a new code? I don't know that.
Mhm. Excuse me, another question is, can you talk about therapeutics? When is the right time to start?
So as early as possible. And many times the therapeutics are partnering with a diagnostic. So if that's an option, so under the diagnostic tool, and then the therapeutic tool is aligned with that. But as early as you can get your data, as early as you can look at, all right, is this going to require coverage? Is this going to require coding?
Okay, another question. When considering adding more test subjects at say 50,000 per person to boost our case for higher reimbursement for a hernia mesh, is there a break-even analysis or way to leverage data to figure out what threshold we'd need to receive higher reimbursement codes?
So was kind of a complicated question. So, number of patients is not going to drive your payment. Your study sample needs to be driven by what you need to meet your endpoint. You need to have your inclusion and exclusion criteria, and your end result is going to be what drives coverage and payment. But just because you add another 50 patients, that has no guarantee on, especially on payment. You first need to focus on, do you have the right number of patients to meet your endpoint? And do you have the right inclusion and exclusion criteria? And also a large enough sample size, like pharma, obviously there's a much higher requirement for patient size for a device, sometimes you'll see 150, 200 patients for a device, which that would not do anything for pharma.
Yeah. Jake, did that answer your question?
Yep. Thank you.
Doug, I'm going to have you come off mute and ask your question directly. That way, we don't have the monkey in the middle being me.
Sure. In the case example number one, the ischemic stroke, you mentioned that they went down a wrong path, had not verified it, and then you took them through AMA. Specialty Society did not agree with the existing codes, essentially confirming that. Is that something, can we approach them ourselves, or do we have to go through a service or a consultant like yourself to do similar?
So I recommend that all of you develop a relationship with your specialty societies and develop that relationship before you have an ask. And those specialty societies want to know about new technology. They really do. Like, they don't want to be blindsided that something comes on the market that they weren't aware of that impacts their members, which is the physicians. So for Doug, so I would just say to make sure that you have somebody that understands the coding before you go to the specialty society, because the specialty society is not going to do your work. So by the time you go to them, you want a pretty good idea. Here's the codes that are out there. Here's where we want to be. And you want to drive that discussion to work in your favor. But to go back and say, we have this new technology, what codes do we need? They're going to say, that's not my job. Like that's not how it works.
Completely understand. In particular, we had a CFO at a company who said, oh, given what you've told me, we could use this code instead of these other two codes. So how do I find that society, the specialty society that relates in my case?
Yeah. So in that case, unless you have somebody on staff that understands coding, I would reach out to a certified coder, understand that space, and really at least get you 90% there. Like a certified coder can tell you, you know what, this should fit. Then you would go to either the specialty society or the American Medical Association. You have to have a membership to the AMA to request coding verification through them. But you could go to the specialty society as long as you have a relationship with them and you understand what you're asking. Because once you take that step to verify, it's binding.
Yep.
It is binding. Now, if you are clearly a 510K, truly a Me Too, you know what? You may or may not have to go through this full verification process because you really are similar. But if you're just unique enough or you're trying to fit into something, that's when you want to verify.
Thank you.
Another question, Patty, is can you talk about the model in the EU?
I don't do a lot internationally, so I will just, put that out there for transparency. I have worked a lot with like quality adjusted life years, economic statistics that the UK uses. And in that case, I mean, it's based on economics. And NICE will not qualify or cover something unless they're at a certain quality adjusted life year. But I am not an international consultant expert at all. But I will just tell you, cost is much more important there, and decisions can be made on cost. Here in the US, we're a little more passive aggressive about that.
Another question, Patty, do you have an example of a device that became part of a standard hospital care? How does that path work?
Device that becomes part of a standard hospital care. I'm not quite sure if I understand that, but I would say a lot of times, some of the like orthopedic procedures, so knee and hip. I mean, that technology continues to evolve. Companies come out that are different per se, but that's clearly part of standard of care. Same thing in the cardiac space.
Evan, do you want to add a little additional?
Yeah. So Patty, the device I'm working to bring to market is a device that monitors and reports on the level of sleep of NICU babies. And the concept is that we would want to monitor this and know what the value of each baby is and create a standard of care of saying babies need X amount of hours of sleep each day, and they need to sleep this long before they're awoken or things like that. So it's not necessarily there's an issue that we're trying to solve for like a temporary issue. It's literally standard of care. You put on EEGs, you're putting on EKGs, and you're putting on this device.
Yeah. So from a reimbursement perspective, since you will be inpatient, you really most likely will not get additional reimbursement, which that's okay. Sometimes those are the easiest products because you're not trying to say to the hospital, you're going to get additional $500 if you use us. They're not. In the NICU, they get paid a per diem or they get paid a certain amount for that hospital stay. In your case, if there is not data or clinical guidelines that says uninterrupted sleep for NICU is important, you might have to create that data and get your specialty society to help create that standard of care. And maybe that means that the babies gain weight faster. They can get out of NICU faster. All of those are going to be really key. But if there is not data that says the problem you're solving is important, you're going to have to create that problem and then document the solution. I worked NICU. I will tell you that product is really important. Yeah, that could be exciting. But you're going to have your specialty society to help you with that.
Okay, awesome. Yeah. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Sushesna, do you want to come off mute and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. So basically my question is, any medical technology that we are developing that is intense and that's huge, which will need millions of dollars of funding. So how should, at this early stage, we should go with clinical validation of that kind of technology and build piece by piece along with the validation? So kind of asking you how to build, like how to get the validation from the reimbursement perspective, piece by piece, and connect it to the validation studies.
Look, if I understand your question, I think the first step, if I understand you correctly, is do your clinical validation. So what's your product going to do? What's your expectation that it's going to do from a health outcomes perspective? And then kind of ask those questions. What's your site of service? What providers are going to use? And again, they may not be in stone, but to start figuring out where you fit. And this can be really early on. And then you can start to understand the reimbursement. So if your clinical validation was going to be X, someone may say, you know what, that's a nice to have, but it's not essential. So what about validating this? And then your reimbursement person can start to say, all right, here's how this technology would pay if it's an outpatient. Here's how it would pay as an inpatient. But reimbursement should not drive your clinical validation. Let me repeat that. Reimbursement should not drive your clinical validation. Companies will say, I'm going to do X because it gets paid really well. And physicians will use this. And by the way, it might actually work. Again, I'll ruin the ending. It's not going to end well. You have to start clinically and then convince them that the financial component also works. But if you start financially and then try to build clinically, it's a house built in cards.
What it is. How are you feeling?
All right, thank you.
One last question, Patty, and then we'll take a break. This is from Kurt. This has been great, but focused on private and civilian sector. Would these topics differ for the military?
Yes and no. All of the things we covered, clinical evidence, understanding your reimbursement strategy early
What
is important. If you are
I'm worried
only,
about, what I'm worried about with with the
Hey,
possible.
Lisa, can you go on mute?
For wearing your hearing aids, sometimes you get sensitive.
okay. So for the military, the big difference there is most of those coverage decisions are based on budget, and you need to be on their annual budget. Again, sometimes that's easier, sometimes that's more difficult. But especially now with kind of budget cuts, they're going to ask the same question. What patients does this work on? Do you impact outcomes? And what's your value proposition and what's the cost? Coding may not be as difficult because they can kind of do what they want, just like a Kaiser or a Mayo Clinic. I'd say they're similar to the military, that they're integrated system and they can make their own choices. So if you're only going the military route, then that value proposition will be directed at that, but you still need to consider clinical evidence and what's your value proposition.
Great, thank you.
All right, terrific. So let's plan to take a 10-minute break. We'll break from now till about 10:15, and then we'll come back and get going again. And Kevin will adjust his bad math. Yes, well, why don't we jump in? What we're going to do is we're going to call a little bit of an audible. We were going to have a little bit of a breakout exercise, but instead we're going to stay together and keep going through some of the Q&A because we still see questions coming up. So with that in mind, I'll have Jason, are you back online? I'll have you kind of ask your question directly.
Sure. Yes. Thank you. So it sounds to me, like the first step, the very first thing, after finding a code that seems to match is to verify the existing code. So I wanted to confirm that was kind of the first step in this process. But then just wanted to know, and I always wonder what you would consider verifying that code to be, or what that criteria would be.
And so your question on finding a code and then verifying is the first step in the coding part, but that doesn't get you the coverage and all of that. So I just want to clarify that. But when you're talking about coding, yes, making sure that you're looking at all codes. When I do my assessment, I will go in and I will look at the notes from the AMA CPT panel mini. I will look at all of the resources that have been allocated to that code. I will look at what physician group is using that code. Because if you have a code that's been used by cardiologists and now you're going to try to get into neurology with the same code, that's going to be a challenge. But to answer your question on verification, one of two ways. You can set up a time with the specialty society. And it's usually like a PowerPoint presentation. It's a good opportunity to introduce them to the new technology. I always say, here's what we're thinking from a coding perspective. Want to get your thoughts. If the specialty society blesses it, you know, for the most part, you should be good. If it is a controversial one, which I'm dealing with right now in remote physiological monitoring, the RPM codes, we are actually going to submit a formal request to the AMA CPT network. And they will come back and say, yes, that's the right code. No, it's not. This process took me all the way up to their board, because if AMA come back and says that's not the right code, they don't have a code. But at the meantime, I'm like, without that verification, you can't be telling your providers to bill it. So verification would come from either AMA, specialty societies, or a payer. You know, new technology, Aetna may say, I love this technology. You can use XYZ. United Healthcare may say, no, that doesn't work. Did that answer it, Jason?
It did. Thank you.
Excellent. Other questions? You can raise your hand or put them in the chat. Dieter, you want to go ahead?
Sure. So my question is, so we have a technology that would be used during surgery. It would be a new procedure, so I really thought there would be an existing CPT code, but it would extend the duration that the patient spends in the operating room. So do you think we would need a new CPT code to cover any procedure in this case?
So I don't know. So if it is truly a procedure that is routinely done, and your new device is for the same indications, same patient mix, same site of service, but for some reason, if I heard you correctly, the OR time is going to be extended?
Yes, so it's a cancer surgery, and our procedure would basically improve the efficacy of the surgical outcome.
So in that case, then something has to be different there. Like if it's just the same device, same patient, and you're extending the OR time.
Sorry, it's a new device. It's a drug device combination that's currently not used. So that would be added to the surgery, but it's performed during the surgical procedure.
So without knowing more, I don't think I can give you a definite answer, but just if the only difference is you take longer, which I'm guessing is not, this is a lot more complicated. but if it changes how it's done, so if they do a different biopsy, they do a different incision, a different approach, then you have an opportunity to say this existing code may not fit. And that's just part of the review of it. But if you really are same approach, same provider, same patient, and just the end outcome is better, it may not be a new code.
Okay.
All right, Chris from Jura, I just want to make sure we touched off on your question from earlier. Did you get what you needed?
I think there's like too much nuance and just gobble up time, but I'm actually writing Patty a LinkedIn connection right now, so I can take it offline. But thank you for checking back in.
Okay, other questions?
I have a question. My medical device actually has an oral health component also. So I was curious about medical insurance versus dental insurance. Is this all the same for dental, or is it completely different? That's a different category.
Dental is completely different, unless Medicare actually just as of 2024 did include some dental coverage under Medicare for the first time, but that's only under very specific criteria, mainly cancer treatment of the jaw, or surgically related. Otherwise, if it's truly under dental, in some ways it's easier because patients are kind of used to self-pay. Even with dental insurance, you have so much out of pocket anyway.
Yeah.
But your coding would be a little different. Typically the dental codes begin with the letter D. The AMA does not control those codes. So it would be different unless you truly are like a cancer treatment that's surgical, then Medicare may be involved.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like Medicare would cover it. Honestly, it doesn't matter to me whether it's medical care or dental care coverage. I don't know how I would even choose, but
I don't think it will be a choice, first of all. It will be either or. Frankly, I would think you're better aligned with your dental. I'm just telling you from the overall high level assessment, there's more flexibility under dental than there could be for oral health under medical.
Interesting. Okay, thanks.
The other questions?
I had a question about is there a way to have multiple different codes covered simultaneously? So I knew of a company that used a peripheral nerve block in the hip, and then they were covered for everything below that hip as well. So for mine, it's atherosclerosis, but there's like, I don't know, I just looked it up, and at least 10 different codes depending on where the pain exists. Did it exist before? Is it going to exist? Is it known? I mean, who the heck knows that kind of stuff yet? You know, is it possible to have just more broad scale or multiple codes applied simultaneously?
So the simple answer is yes, under certain circumstances, like a good space, like endoscopy. Endoscopy almost always has more than one CPT code because they may code it for the approach, they may code the aspiration or the biopsy, whatever they're doing. Lab typically has multiple, they call stacked codes. In your example of about a peripheral nerve block, you know, there may be a code for the injection, and then there may be another code for others. And some of those, the level of specificity that you mentioned, I don't know if you're talking about diagnosis codes or CPT codes, but short answer is yes, there are times that you do have multiple codes. Again, you really need to understand that because a lot of times if you have 3 codes, the first code is paid at 100%, the second at 50, the third at 25. And if you're the third code, you may get some pushback. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Patty. I have another question on, I think, kind of following the last one. Let's say if we have a new medication, but it's in a form of slow releasing gel that we need to implant to the tumor cavity after craniotomy and tumor resection in the brain. For that kind of, I guess, more medication invention, do we still need to request for a new CPT code? Or is just gonna be the old code of craniotomy injection, or is it like a new code to cover the new set of procedures to implant the gel or the drug?
So typically, drugs that are used in a procedure are typically covered under the procedure payment. So in your case, brain surgery, guessing it's going to be an inpatient procedure, that hospital is going to get either a per diem or a DRG. Most likely, your medication is going to fall under that overall payment, and you most likely won't need your own code. From the FDA, you'll get an NDC number so that hospital can identify what was used, but they're not looking for separate payment, so they don't need a separate code. Now, if a medication is self-administered, or just all 100% patient driven, or sometimes even in the office setting, then you might need to get a J code for that pharma. But in your example, I believe you would be under the DRG and would not need a separate code.
Right, thank you.
Hey, Patty, we have Medicaid approval in Colorado, and we're starting to expand outside the state and, of course, to commercial payers. It's just shocking to me how expensive and laborious this process is per state, per payer. Do you have, one, an easy solution to the anxiety that creates? And two, do you have like a rule of thumb on, how to budget that? Like, on average, a state with Medicaid and the three biggest private payers will cost you $3,000 in credentialing submissions. Or is it just you kind of pad your strategy and you got to go in there and you figure out all the nuts and bolts and there you have it?
So good question. And I feel for you. And I always kind of say sometimes it's job security because it's ridiculous. It really is. So I don't have an answer to reduce that anxiety other than either bring the right team internally, make sure you have good clinical data, because if you have good clinical data, it's going to be a lot easier than fighting tooth and nails when you don't have good data. As far as like a budget, when I do those, it's typically not by state. It's kind of identifying, all right, how many payers. And I always say start where your main utilization is, and it may be key opinion leaders. And don't take on the whole US. Start locally, get some success, and then move on.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, other questions? A nice comment in the chat for you, Patty. This was great, Patty. Thank you. I love this because it reinforces that we as entrepreneurs need to understand the vocabulary, but we cannot do this alone. And that was from Lisa.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right, no more questions. Oh, Izzy, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you so much, Patty. This is incredibly useful. I guess I was hearing that therapeutics, like a small molecule drug that's taken by the patients at home, there's a code for that as well. That's you'd mentioned that with companion diagnostics, there's more complicated coding. With inpatient procedures or as part of a procedure, there's more complicated coding. But do the drugs themselves have codes?
Yes, typically they would. And so in that case, if the patient's administering it at home, I'm guessing they're picking it up at the pharmacy or having it, I mean, some of them may be able to be mailed to, and it would be covered under the pharmacy benefit. Sometimes you can just get by with your NDC number, which is every drug is given one of those when they get FDA approval and you get put on the kind of the red book list. But if it's going to be reimbursed separately, you may need to get a J code. And getting a J code for a drug is pretty straightforward. It is not political. It's not complicated. By law, if you are the only drug in that category, they have to give you a J code. So it's just merely to identify it.
Okay, this is so useful. Thank you so much.
All right, any final questions?
Hi, Patty. So I have one, maybe the final question right here. We are developing a technology for sepsis diagnosis, rapid sepsis diagnosis. When I look at the code, they have a lot of sepsis-related code, and they start with A, that start with a different letter R. So I'm just curious. They have, I think they're more related to the what type of maybe some symptoms were very detailed categorized of systematic inflammatory syndrome. So they have any specific starting letter for the diagnosis, or in that case?
I guess my first question is this a blood test?
Yes, that's
Yeah.
a type of blood test.
Yeah. So again, without knowing more about it, I mean, typically this would be a lab, right? It's going to be sent to the lab.
Yeah. So not necessarily to the central lab, but some operator needed to run some quick test.
A little hard to answer without more information. If this is strictly a blood test and the nurse or, I'm just going to
maybe can perform near the patient while patient,
Yeah.
can be what we expect can be performed at the ER, doctor's office, or in patient, multiple clinic settings, environment.
So you may get a code, you may not. Like there is, per se, if they do a finger stick for glucose in the ER, that's not paid separately. Now, if they do a blood draw and they send it to a lab, typically there's a CPT code that identifies what test is being run.
Yeah, in this case, I think what we position our technologies can be easily incorporated to the current procedure for the, for the sepsis diagnosis, because sepsis right now is taking quite a long time to get the lab test, especially for the blood culture. So our test can be fully incorporated to the blood draw, just get a tiny bit from the blood is gonna be sent to the blood culture lab, and then we can run the test on site and at least give you some preliminary NAP results, assay results. So that's our, where we position our test.
Yeah. And most likely if it's an inpatient, it's not going to get additional reimbursement anyway, lab, all of the tests. If it's in the ER, it may be just part of the overall ER. So depending on how costly it is, if it's not costly, you probably want to focus on making that standard of care versus worrying about if they get paid for it.
Okay.
But if it's an expensive test, then you're going to need to take a step back and say, making sure that users are paid for it. But like today, like a blood culture test is minimal.
Yeah. So the blood culture test, I'm just curious to know, is get a CPT code, specifically CPT code?
I believe it is. Most times it's not paid separately, but
okay. But you said that's really not that expensive at all, right? So
no.
Okay. Yeah. So I think our test is should be that cheaper, and so that's maybe you said it can be, instead of getting the reimbursement, maybe can be incorporated to the standard of care, or
Absolutely.
just okay. Thank you.
All right. No final questions? So Patty, if you could give us just a little bit of background on your company and the type of services that you provide so that the group is aware, and kind of can tuck that into their minds a little bit.
Sure. So, I mean, just again, a little bit about my background. I was at Medtronic 15 years and led the neurological division and then diabetes when they purchased MiniMed. I then started a company, a data analytic company that I had recently sold about 2 years ago and kind of came back to consulting. So for Pinpoint Access, I work with a lot of investors, work with companies trying to get money from investors. I work with companies that need new CPT codes. I partner with companies if someone truly needs a coverage feet on the street. I partner with some of my colleagues to do that. I do a lot of the assessments at a high level, saying, here's your potential codes, here's your potential challenges. So really working on all components from coverage, coding, and payment. And work across all indications from neuro to cardiac to ortho to diabetes, etc.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for the session today. This has been great. I don't know if there's any final thoughts you'd like to provide before we jump into our next topic.
You know what? Let me just share my screen real quick and just do the one summary page.
Okay.
Didn't do those. So here, and I think this these slides will be available, right? Right, Kevin?
Yes.
Yeah. So here really is just kind of a nice checklist that you can use to kind of come back, and some of it will come back to, oh, Patty said that. Like, don't create a laundry list of value claims without considering the cost and time to develop the clinical evidence to support those claims. Map out the reimbursement pathway. Understand the plan for, outline the financial investment that it's going to take for getting to the market. So all of this is just like a nice summary, Kevin, that I'd like to make sure everybody has it.
Yeah.
And if you're more than 2 years from market, it's still important to ask these questions, but it needs to be updated. So if you're 5 years from now, you may get the status for today, but that could change by 5 years. So just know it's not a one and done.
Excellent. Patty, thank you very much for this. This is great. I know it's a topic that isn't always front of mind. As an audit judge, we often see this is something that people hold off thinking about until a bit later, which can be problematic. But really appreciate the information today and you're taking the time to be with us.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you. Nice to meet everybody.
Great. Have a great day. All right. We are going to shift gears. And so we are now, believe it or not, we're about 2/3 of our way through the program. And typically what we do after we finish this workshop is we open up to collect a little bit of feedback about kind of what's needed and what's next. So we like to check in with you, take your feedback in terms of what has been really useful so far. But then also take some time to say, well, are there things that you were expecting to get in the program that you haven't seen yet? Or are there things that, we touched on where you'd like more depth? How do we want to think about that? So we're going to take a bit of time today to have you kind of break out amongst yourselves and spend some time on that discussion. So Again, the key element here is, one of the elements we think this program is differentiated by is its customization. So how do we tailor our support to help you achieve your critical milestones? The objective we have is to get that feedback from you on what's been useful so far and what will be most valuable as we go into Q3. We'll use this to kind of inform our strategy for content, for lunch and learns, for fireside chats, for other resources. So we're going to break you out into 7 self-led groups for this discussion. So these are the groups. So if you haven't renamed yourself, make sure you rename yourself with your group number in front of you. And so we're going to have the breakouts aligned to our mastermind groups. And then we'll have the Innisphere team is going to meet separately and answer the same set of questions as we kind of go forward. 2 roles we need you to appoint in your group relatively quickly is one is a note taker. So someone who can record your key points, the examples, the stories, and any themes that are emerging inside your group. And then we also need a timekeeper. So we're gonna, keep the time that we have a discussion limited to 15 minutes per segment, and then a 5-minute period to kind of think about your priorities. But we need everyone to keep on track with that so we get the same type of feedback from each of the groups. And so the 3 tasks we'll have you do, first we'll ask you to spend 15 minutes thinking about what are the high value aspects of the program. What have been most valuable to your startups? Have there been any particular workshops or mentorship or networking or other resources that made a significant impact? And then can you provide some specific examples of stories of how it's benefited your startup? So you'll have that discussion amongst yourselves. And then after that 15 minutes, kind of shift gears to talk about some of the gaps and needs. So are there areas you feel the program could offer more support? Are there challenges that you're facing that you don't feel have been adequately addressed by the incubator? And are there resources, connections, or types of expertise you believe would be valuable, but you have not yet been provided? And then we'll take a final 5 minutes, basically to have you discuss which of the gaps that you've discussed in your group do you feel is most critical to address, and any immediate steps or action items that we should be considering. After that, we'll gather back and we'll try and do a readout or 2. I'm going to have to check my timing to see where we're at when we gather back. But we'll look for a group or 2 to kind of share what they talked about. And then I'll ask all the groups, the note takers, to share the output with me after the session today. So with that, Ravi's going to separate us all out. And once he gets us all in a room, he's going to set his timer for 35 minutes, at which point we'll all come back together. So take it away, Ravi. Right, welcome back. Looks like almost everybody is back. Just 1 second here. All right, we have about 10 minutes. I'd like to get maybe 1 or 2 groups to just kind of volunteer to share a little bit of what they talked about. Does anybody want to go first? Any volunteers?
Kevin, I'll chime in real quick. Big piece of feedback from kind of everybody. Loved the workshops like the one we just had, but we would all love some one-on-one time with those people, and recognizing fully that's complicated in terms of costs and scheduling. But we left with a great overview, but not clear action items kind of to take to task the next day.
Any other thoughts out of your group, Chris?
We had tons and tons of great notes. Yeah, I think networking was good. Mentorship was good. we're all kind of excited and chomping at the bit to raise a whole bunch of money. And so now excited to learn in this third phase how that looks. I think everybody was attending Breckenridge, and so major kudos to getting us in there for free. And then in terms of resources, a couple of us had pitched to the Innosphere group and loved it, even though sometimes the feedback was hard to hear, a little brutal. And then I'll speak for Jura, we had, access to PitchBook a few times that was like worth its weight in gold. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Right, great. What were your key gaps other than the access to the one-on-one?
Okay, so we might have gone about this task a little bit differently and went about, but the key gaps were definitely the one-on-one. I think in terms of, maybe this is my own summary, in terms of networking, haven't seen it yet, but again, super excited for Breckenridge. Fort Collins is just a little bit tough. And then of course we had a member of our group from Texas, so it makes it a little bit tougher there too. And then the other gap is just fundraising, like how these things are awesome. Like a really very specific example we've heard now a few weeks in a row. We've had this amazing consultant come in and give us an overview of pitch decks and storytelling and reimbursement, and that ends with now you should hire a consultant, but we don't have a lot of money. In some cases, we have no money. And so, what do you do with that? And in some ways, you like take a lot of Tums, right? And then you just put it on the list of things to do, which is already in the 700s. So kind of left there with a gap.
Was there any key content your group talked about as wanting to see in the third quarter?
I think I think we all have a different one-on-one need, so that might have been a nice action item for us, is to be more specific about that, and then raising money, like and that includes, I think we'll have some discussion about what does it mean to be ready, so which kind of feeds back to that one-on-one time.
All right, great. All right, can I get one more group to kind of give me a little bit of their summary feedback? Bob, I see you got your hand up down there.
So I took a long list. There's a little scribbles here. Today's session, we just started with that one. For one of the groups, one of the teams in our group, it was incredible, very valuable. They had no prior knowledge. Others who are further along, it was irrelevant. First of all, irrelevant, not in the space. And actually that was for a few of us. And let's see something. And a third person had the background on this was very superficial. Lots of things you got to pay attention to, but not lots of what your ARs should be, what your actions required following this to improve. I think that's the best way to see it. We went over and talked about the prior presentations, what we liked, what we didn't like. Presentation on patents was well received. Presentation on Cindy Skalicki's, it ranged from not helpful to very helpful. There was a desire, and I think it came out sort of in the gaps, want more specific guidance on business planning and finance. And to that, I personally added, and if you were to restructure the program, we're going to start building your data room. And these are the components that are going to go in the data room when you bring in the speakers to teach you how to do that. And at the end, you're going to have a full data room ready for Tim Jones to go to work and his team, and a presentation that's going to knock Tim Jones' socks right off, right? That's it, just sort of a restructuring thing. Gaps and needs. These Q&A session today that we had was really valuable. Why not send out the slides before we can read the slides and spend the vast majority of the time on Q&A. Going over case studies, discussing those things. And then one other ask would be kind of interesting. If we could get case studies presented from your prior cohorts, somebody who went through this a year ago and has that's really recent experiences.
Bob, was there any specifics on the experiences people were looking for?
I would think on the specifics they would look for is I would just tell you a deeper dive. So if we got, for example, the slides 5 days before, we read through them. Now listen, getting people, we're all busy to read through 5 things is when you're getting 200 emails a day is always a challenge. That's usually what I would say. That would be my counter if I was managing the program. But that might enable a deeper dive question to be developed.
And I guess I was referring also to the kind of case studies. Is there any specific case study types that people said, boy, what I really like to hear is how someone navigated a reimbursement process, or
yeah, no, I think that really the case study would, and the others in the cohort would have to answer for me, but I think it is, did they, where they somebody 2 years down ahead of us, whatever the case is, where their business is at, that's the case study. And then the case study is the subset of that. Was there a document in their data room that was weak and they needed more help? And that's what I'd like to hear from previous cohorts. And you may collect that when you've surveyed and do that. But
right, great.
Does that help?
It does help. Yeah, I really appreciate everybody taking the time to have this discussion. And I know we kind of pick a couple of you today to get your feedback, but if all the note takers can send me your notes, that would be great. We're going to assemble them. We'll be looking to kind of put together, this is the fun part of my job. I get to kind of put together the curriculum for Q3 kind of on the fly. So responding to some of the needs that you've raised here and some of the things we'd like to see, make sure that we're pulling those forward into the program so that you get that before the end. So it's super helpful, really appreciate it. And if you can send me those, we'll follow up once we get everybody's feedback. So I'm going to, just to keep us on time today, turn it over to Tim. And Tim's going to give a little bit of an overview on mentors, advisors, and boards.
So I'll tell you, good morning, good afternoon. Let me make sure I've got my screen set up here. And okay, and so yeah, the conversation here today really is to set the stage around what are the differences, how do you accelerate the growth of your company by bringing in folks that maybe act as mentors, maybe act as board members or advisors, et cetera. When should you think about doing that over the course of your journey? And then ultimately, I think I've heard that maybe there's some questions about compensation and how that works for maybe each one of these. So I'll do my best to touch on that, but certainly feel free to jump in with questions or examples that you may have, of each of these relationships and how they've worked specifically for you. So I would say that, the first one let's start with is mentors. And I would argue that this is probably one where, this is kind of the first step in your journey that you would take. And these folks, right, are kind of meant to be not necessarily your best friend, but, you can kind of sit down with them and for the price of a coffee or a lunch, right, really have that conversation around, gosh, I'm thinking about doing this. And that may be in relation to your business, maybe in relation to, your personal life, whatever that happens to be, but it's kind of conversational, right? And, in general, what they're going to provide, of course, is, hey, some level of support that says, this is what I experienced. Maybe you ought to consider, doing this, this, and this. I know plenty of folks that are early stage founders, that get together, right, as with multiple folks and almost fill this, kind of mentor role amongst each other, and they really try to, I think Bob, you're bringing up maybe even case studies for later companies, but there's one in particular that I'm thinking of that it's a broad range of different businesses and they get together, whatever it is, once a month. There's some that are farther along their journey than others, and they just try to share what's going on. This one is very informal, right? And so it's an opportunity to get together and bounce ideas off each other and try to understand how that goes. I would caveat this a little bit and say in one of my previous businesses, we tried to formalize this mentor role a little bit more than just, hey, let's have coffee in the morning type of thing. We felt that there was some value to doing that. So, just kind of planting that seed. It doesn't necessarily have to, be formalized, but there you go. So that's a little bit about, mentors, and we'll talk in some future slides here a little bit more detail of, maybe kind of timing around those and, a little bit around expectations too. The second, I guess, group of folks that I would argue probably, you interact with here on your journey is advisors, right? And so that could be individually, it could be a group, so you could have an advisory board, right? But arguably here, how I would characterize these folks, right, is more around like the business offense, right? So folks that are thinking about strategy, they're thinking about, where should you go next? How can I, help plug in? These are the markets I know, and what does your business model look like, and competition out there, and things like that. What they are not, right, is they do not have a fiduciary responsibility. They don't have a vote in your business, right? They don't have authority, right? Their advice, of course, is not binding. Typically, if they have a role, right, it's set by an agreement. It's not by any sort of statute, right? And so sometimes we get a little bit of confusion between what we would consider to be advisory boards and your board of directors. So, be thoughtful about that. These folks really are, maybe to plug in and, essentially to augment some of the gaps in your skill set, right, amongst the team. Ultimately, maybe they're a good choice for a board of director at a later point when you put one together. But, that's kind of where they're at. We have on here, right, typically compensated through equity. So, I'm going to take a pause here. I think this is an area that I've heard that is of interest. When I, have startup companies and they have, advisors that are very involved and things like that, I tend to see a level of compensation through, the common stock of the business that, is maybe anywhere up to kind of a 1% number, right? And that has a lot to do with what your expectations are when you're talking to these advisors, right? It's not unusual at all to see kind of a quarter or a half, maybe 3/4 up to kind of 1%. I don't see a whole lot more than that. But again, it really depends on what their level of involvement is. You really ought to have some level of, agreement set up with these folks, a little bit different than a mentor. But that's, a little bit here about your advisory board. And so just make sure when you're having the conversation, right, there's mentor has one connotation to it, advisor has a different connotation. And, again, right, your mentor is, working with you, right? Maybe there's a business, maybe there's personal things that you're having the conversations with, whereas the advisor, again, is really around the offense of the business, right? Where is your strategy and where do you want to take that business, ultimately? And so then let's introduce the concept here of, board of directors. And I'm going to caveat this and say, hey, I am not a lawyer. I will try to toss out some things that I've learned over time, because once you get to, the board of directors, there then is a fiduciary responsibility associated with that. There's actually state law that governs, right, what a board looks like. And, typically, if you're an LLC, you're not necessarily required to have boards, but if you go to a C Corp, for instance, you're going to have that requirement. And these folks, I would argue, much more on the kind of the business defense side. And I'm going to say, that very generically, right? Because of these responsibilities, right? These fiduciary responsibilities are associated with being a board member. That's not to say that they can't get involved in business strategy and trying to drive the direction of the business. But they have that level of responsibility now that's associated with being a member of the board of directors. So you can have, right, a board of directors as well as, of course, an advisory board. Okay. And, those two can work and coexist in a business, and there's no issue there. Simply because board of directors responsibilities is different than your advisor board. Okay. We listed on here, hey, kind of some of the high level things that that a board of directors do. I'm gonna add, a couple of additional thoughts here from an investor standpoint, right? It adds a lot of credibility to the business, right? When you're thinking about this, could potentially extend the network out there who, depending on who is actually on your board. In a lot of cases, it drives the accountability. So depending on where you are in your journey, right? We will ask for board meeting minutes, right, as part of the data room. I think Bob was bringing that up earlier. And we will read through those. So this is an important part, right, of the business as you put it together. There's a subset of board of directors that they're called board observers, right? That maybe aren't active members of the board that are, voting, et cetera. So these folks, will tend to sit and, in the background, right? And they have typically access to all the information that your typical board of directors, your active board of directors actually, has. So they'll get that, they can attend board meetings typically, but, they're basically silent observers. I bring that up because I've seen quite a few investors want to take that role. So they have access to all that data, but they don't want to be an active participant in the board for a variety of reasons. Okay. So that's just kind of the introduction of the three different things here, right, around, mentorship, advisors, and your fiduciary board of directors. Questions or thoughts here? Examples? Otherwise, we'll kind of jump into, timing and then maybe a little bit around how you set these folks up. Oh, actually, I forgot to mention the compensation here for board of directors, right? I did that for your advisory board. So, mentors typically is just a lunch or a cup of coffee. Advisory board, maybe up to 1%, right, equity. So board of directors, typically when they're getting stood up, right, you'll probably have an investor that's on the board. They would not be compensated, beyond the amount of their investment. But if you're bringing in, for instance, an independent, right? So maybe the initial board is going to be 3. It's going to be you as CEO. It'll be an independent board member, and then it'll be an investor. Your compensation is taken care of. It's actually, written by the board. The second one would be the investor. There's no, additional compensation, typically beyond what, their investment makes. But then as a independent board of director, right, if you're going to go off and recruit somebody there, again, I kind of see, folks there that maybe it's a 0.25% up to, 1.5% kind of thing is what I see, right? 1% again, kind of a good number, I would say there for, independent board of directors. You just, be very thoughtful, of course, about how much equity you're giving up, and especially about, how much involvement, these folks are going to have and what you're really wanting from them. And I would say in both cases, board of directors as well as the advisory boards or advisors, you want to think about, some sort of vesting schedule associated with that too. Kind of 2 to 3 years is typically what I see. I generally do not see for an early stage startup any sort of cash compensation. Okay, so that's a significant difference than what you may see in, you know, a publicly traded company, or even, you know, a much later stage business where that would not be unusual to see some cash. Early stage, if folks want cash, they're probably not a good choice for you. Okay, unless you have cash to burn, feel free, you know, do what you want. All right, so I'm gonna move on here. Thoughts, questions, concerns about, you know, kind of setting the table here between, you know, these three different roles that that you can certainly hopefully use to help accelerate the business.
Yeah, Tim, this is really great. I have a question about the CEO's role on the board of directors.
Okay.
Basically, how does that work? Do they actually have a board seat, or are they just basically answering to the board of directors and taking feedback from them?
Yeah, yeah. So Bob, looked like you may have a question too, so we'll get you here in a minute. But yeah, so Dan, typically what wind up happening, right? And so whenever we make an investment from the fund, right, we would stand up a board of directors already in place. Typically, it would be a 3-person board. It would be the CEO, right? It would be an independent, and then it would be, you know, with some sort of market experience typically. So what winds up usually happening for that would be a, you know, most cases we ask the chairman to you know, the CEO to actually make a recommendation, and then we have to approve it. And then we would take the third board seat as an investor. And it's usually the lead investor in the round that would take that board seat. You know, there may be other investors that participate, but they would typically not get a board seat. Okay. So that's kind of a little bit difference between a lead investor and follow on. So yes, the CEO of the business usually has a board seat. In some cases, they would chair the board. In some cases, they don't chair the board. And we do that on a case-by-case basis. Okay. I would tell you that you know, a couple of boards that I'm on, I'm actually a chair of one of the boards, and I'm a board member on the on another one, right? So depends a little bit upon, you know, where you're going there. So yes, the CEO typically is the representative from the business on the board, and you know, beyond voting for their own compensation package, right? They're a full member of the board. All right, Bob, I'm not sure if you had a question.
No, my question is, at what point do we need to start getting concerned about purchasing D&O insurance?
Yeah, so great question. We write that into our contract. So if you are going to, I mean, I would argue that as you go through and interview board members, if they don't ask that question, they may not necessarily be a good board member for you, right? Certainly not experienced. But we actually write that in our as terms of our investment agreement. You have to procure, you know, $1 million of D&O insurance, 100%. And oh, by the way, as an investor, we have that for our fund too. We procure our own D&O.
Is there a good resource where we can find out budget numbers for D&O so we can have it in our budgets?
Yeah, I would just go to, you know, like an IMA or somebody like that's an insurance broker.
Okay.
You know, or I mean, ask around, right? I mean, gosh, I could tell you what, you know, dollars are for the businesses that.
Yeah, well, you know from your experience. I just want. It's been a long time since I bought. It was in a position you have to buy it. I just.
Yep. 100%.
Thank you.
Doug, looks like you got your hand in the air here.
Just a clarification, do you say typically the company provides that insurance or covers the expense, or they provide it themselves?
No, the business goes off and procures the D&O insurance.
Okay.
Yep, that covers the board. And yeah. I was just saying, as an investor in a venture capital fund, we procure that, right? Also for our directors in the fund too.
Okay.
That's kind of dual coverage, but yeah. Was there something in chat?
Yeah, there's a question in chat, Tim.
Okay.
What about key opinion leaders? How does their role differ from advisors? Key opinion leaders are more public facing for branding marketing versus advisors who actually advise on company strategy and decisions. When, if ever, should you think about key opinion leaders and how they are typically compensated?
Yeah, so good question, right? This was specifically geared towards kind of an advisory role. It's all well and good to have a key opinion leader involved in some sort, right? I mean, if you're going to go a contract route with them, that's a vendor contract agreement, right? If you're looking for them to, get your name out or whatever it is, that's perfectly fine. If they are going to be an advisor, they would still fall underneath, I guess, the kind of what we discussed here today. I would tell you that as an investor, I see a lot of advisory board or advisor slides that come up, right? And that's typically part of the pitch deck. You probably all got my, hey, what are the slides that are required as part of a pitch at some point? I think may have been sent out to you. You'll note that on there is no slide that says include your advisors, right? And one of the reasons why I do that, and this is just a little bit of a hook here, is that whenever I see an advisor slide, especially if there's a significant key opinion leader, let's call it, my question is, well, great, you have these folks on a slide. How involved are they? Right? And we're going to have the conversation. You open the door, I'm going to walk through it. And if you tell me, yeah, I talked to them once, I'm saying, well, okay, great. I write that off. I'm moving on. Right? There's no value added, at least high level. As well as, gosh, if you have advisors on the slide, I may or may not have a connection to them, and I'm going to go reach out to them. And if they say, gosh, I don't know Doug or Janet or Susie or the company, you're in trouble, right? So I'm not advocating that having a slide like that with your advisors is bad, and I'm not advocating that having KOLs as an advisor is bad. I'm just suggesting that if you're going to present that as folks like that as an advisor, who knows who I know, who knows what our team knows, who knows what we're going to do as an investor to go off and actually then say, okay, what's that relationship? And and if it's not there, then it starts to call into question maybe some of the other things that you're telling me to. So I'm going to toss that out there, right? So there you go. Hopefully that answered the question. Maybe I went a little overboard. I'm not sure. But Jason, looks like you got your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to make a comment, having done this before a few times, is that I would suggest having a board before you officially need to, or another way is walk before you run. So even if it's you and another employee, which technically a board of two people is not really a board, but for a lot of registrations, you have to put board members anyway. So go ahead and have that board. Set up a quarterly meeting. If it's 30 minutes, take minutes, which is just saying we met, basically. There's just basic language, but start practicing that. Look at your financial situation, look at your cash, talk about things, maybe complain about things, have a sandwich, whatever. But if you just start that practice before an investor says, especially before a potential investor says, oh, I want to be on the board, and you say, oh, okay, I guess we have to start having board meetings now. I think it just puts you in a much better place. And like I said, it's better to walk before you run.
Jason, I love that idea. And I would tell you that, building that muscle is good, not only from an investor standpoint, but I would argue that I think I've seen some studies, right, that have businesses with boards, they actually perform better, right? Because you are looking at things, you're very conscious about that and what you're doing. I would tell you that whenever I become involved in a board as an early stage investor, I take the time to actually send a package of stuff to the business and say, this is what I want to see as a board member, right? And this is how often I want to see it, and this is your operating rhythm. Bob, you mentioned, hey, I'd love to see the slides 5 days beforehand. 100%. If I'm not getting the slides as a board member beforehand, that meeting is not valuable then to anybody involved, right? So, 100%. I do that. I don't know how many other investors will do that. I mean, I know a handful that will, especially as early stage. But yeah, if you can already have that rhythm and say, Tim, shut up, I got this covered, makes my life easier. We're moving on. So yeah. All right. Oh, Bob, for you.
I had another one real
Go ahead.
quick, but
Yeah.
when the last time I was a board observer was going back about 10 years ago, and now I see people selling software packages that produce the board package. I don't know if this applies to anybody here, and if it doesn't, just say no, and we'll have to take that conversation offline. But if it does, let me know what you think.
Yeah. So Bob, I actually the Innisphere board, we use ZecDeck, as a method to do that. I'm not exactly sure how valuable that is. And I'm the guy that's filling that out, right, for the Innisphere board at this point. So I'm kind of where you would be in your shoes. There are some very good things about it. Does it, I'm pretty confident in PowerPoint. So making a PowerPoint slide ain't that big of a challenge for me. And that's where I hear a lot of folks saying, oh gosh, it takes up so much time. I don't know. I mean, it's everybody, has their strengths and weaknesses, whatever it is. I would say that the longer we use it, I think I'm more and more sold on that. But, I'm not quite all the way there. I'm not going to sit there and say, yeah, y'all ought to go to to do that. But it does take, some of the administrivia out of board member meetings and all the rest of this, minutes and things like that. So, yeah. I don't see anything else. I'm going to move on here, Kevin. That's all right. Yeah, there we go. So when we think about timing, right, of how to build these folks out and when they should be, typically I would argue that, you start out with your mentors, right? You're having that, maybe you're, before you even start the company, right? You have that idea, you ought to be talking to these folks, right? Oh, how does that sound? Get that feedback, right? And, as well as advisors bringing those folks in. I think that, mentors have a role to play across the board, early stage funding, even, as complexity grows. These folks, and maybe it changes a little bit. I used to work in big corporate and, had mentors there, right? So I think that there's a lot of value there. And, in many cases, they kept me from, doing something really more dumb than I did anyways, but I think there's a lot of value. So yeah, bring those folks on early on. Advisors, again, early stage investor, I see a lot of advisors, and that's fantastic. Just make sure that when you bring those folks on, they have a role to play, especially if you're going to give them any sort of equity, right? You ought to have that agreement with them so that you're all on board with what they're doing. When you get to funding, I would tell you that, again, we're usually the first institutional money in, and I'm going to force a board on you. I just am. And so, there you go. And so then certainly as you grow, I think we talked a little bit about the benefits behind, having a board. There's just a lot of good things that are necessary. And if you're going to raise future rounds, more significant rounds, you're going to need to have these elements in place for folks to be comfortable writing a check. All right. A little bit here for the next, kind of few slides is really around, gosh, how do you set these things up, and, what does it look like and whatnot? So, not sure. There you go. So, mentorship, right? I think that at least in my experience, you have to somewhat get along with these folks, right? You have to have, respect for them, and you have to believe that they have something valuable and to offer to you, right? And so 100% you can engage. These are folks, I think, that can kind of come and go. Are they willing to spend time with you? 100%. There have been some mentors in my life where it's been a little more formal than not. I came out of the military, and I actually am a mentor to folks that are now leaving the military. And what works well in that particular situation is that we set up some, significant ground rules. There are other things where, there are startup founders that I still engage with, and, it's, hey, let's go have lunch. We haven't talked in a while. Let's see what, see what pops up. Or, I got a text this morning from one. Hey, I need some help on compensation. Okay, yeah, I can do that. So, it's a lot more informal in that particular, situation. I would tell you, as from a mentor standpoint, being your mentee being receptive to your input is pretty critical too, right? And so if I'm going to spend time with you, I want to know that there's some value in what I'm saying. So there you go. All right. So that's a little bit about mentors. I mean, these things from all walks of life, and, you all are very experienced. So I think finding them, you can reach into your network. Advisory board, right? Again, this is where I think you need to be a little bit more formal. You probably ought to have an agreement, right? You ought to be thinking about, gosh, who's, what do I need help with? And then going off and targeting folks that make sense to be able to fill those gaps for you, right? At some point in the future, you may be hiring that on. So, these folks may be with you for whatever it is, 2, 3, 4 years and moving, on to something else. Just be very careful again about handing out compensation to folks that you refer to as advisors, and you don't get that value back, right? They need to have a reason beyond, I think, just compensation, right? That to really engage with you. So whatever that connection is, make sure that's all signed. You have an agreement with them. They understand very clearly what they need to do to participate in your business and be an advisor for you. And then lastly, again, the level here, right, is completely different, in my opinion, than an advisory board or a mentor, right? These folks, they have that fiduciary responsibility. You're going to go off, and look for, I think, again, early stage, looking for folks maybe to fill some gaps for you. Maybe they have a certain level of experience. You folks, in many cases, are going to be going through FDA approval. I mean, I heard about CPT codes. Maybe there's some experience level that you're looking for. I'm on a board here where our last search for board of director candidates went through, not only their expertise, but also even a diverse nature in where they are geographically located, maybe where they stood as far as the next raise for the business, also gender diversity and things like that. So again, depending on how you are thinking about building out your board, there's a lot of different elements that ought to go into this, and a lot of thought, quite frankly, because these folks could be a good cultural fit, which is very helpful. And if they're going to roll up their sleeves, because as an early stage board of director, they have a lot of work to do. It's not, in my opinion, a kind of a public board where you're meeting 4 times a year, and then maybe you sit on 1 or 2 committees and you set the compensation and whatnot. No, these folks, you're picking up the phone to them and saying, gosh, my device here just failed the first few trials. What do we do, right? What's our corporate strategy? How are we going to, change the organization whenever somebody, leaves? I mean, all sorts of different things. So there's a lot more involvement at this level. You need to make sure that whenever you engage with these folks, that they are aligned with what you're thinking of. And so, the same is also true. They need to have a vested interest in working with your business. And again, we talked a little about this compensation bit here. I can't say this enough. Your cap table has to be really clean as you go off and continue to raise. So if you're not getting value out of board of directors, whatever it is, that's your cap table. That line, right, could be used for something else, and so just be very thoughtful about that. I think that's about it here. So just a recap, right? All 3 of these different folks, mentors, advisors, board of directors, they can all coexist. They all play different roles, right? And I think you're going to go to them with different problems, different ideas, and you ought to be, I think, requiring different things out of each one of these relationships. And so therefore you ought to be very clear about what you're looking for. They ought to be very clear about why they're excited to work with you or engage with you too. And, you know, I was very serious, right? Whenever Bob was talking about, hey, D&O, there's a variety of different things that I would expect a potential candidate, you know, to come with as far as questions go. And that is not, I mean, that's one of them. There's no doubt that that's one of them. But, you know, you can think through a lot of different things that if they're not asking, you know, questions about, gosh, how do you operate? You know, what are the, you know, what's your strategies, right? I mean, all of these different things, they may not be the right person for you. So, you know, it's all well and good to have somebody that maybe is a friend, family, whatever it is. But if you're looking for, you know, significant input from the board to help your business grow, there are folks out there that are very talented and have done this before and understand what it means to be a board of director and what that commitment is. So, so just be thinking about that, right? Anyways, okay, Kevin, I think I'm done here. Hopefully I'm on time.
All right, any final questions for Tim before we move on?
Yeah, one question, Tim, about board of directors.
Yep.
Is there any way, like, what happens if you have like a board of director that's not actually turns out not to be favorable for the company? How do you go about removing them from the board?
Yeah, so I mean, a couple of different things, right? So one, of course, bad situation to be in, right? So you don't want to get yourself in that situation if at all possible. So let's take that one. But you know, you fall underneath the board bylaws, the procedures, et cetera, that, you know, may say that these folks are appointed for 2 years, et cetera, and it may take a, you know, a board vote, a stockholder vote, et cetera, to remove somebody. You know, and then you got to be thinking about, yeah, I gave you 1.5% that's vested over 3 years, let's say. What are the implications there, right? I mean, it's, yeah. But it's governed in the board documents of how to do that. Oh yeah, look at this. So there's a great book out there. It's called Startup Boards. I guess you can't see it very well, but it's written by a guy named Brad Feld, who hopefully you're all familiar with. I think it's a fantastic resource that you know, I tend to use a lot too, when you're specifically thinking about you know, board of directors and what you ought to be requiring out of them. Any other questions, thoughts? Hopefully that answered the question. I'm not sure.
Yeah, that was good. Thank you.
Okay. Yep.
Tim, I'm sorry, I just missed the name of Brad Feld's book.
Oh, it's just called Startup Boards.
Okay.
Whatever. Yeah. And in fact, what I do is whenever I join a board, I give that to the CEO.
Brad's a very good guy. If you
He
can learn him and get 5 minutes of his ear, you'll get the 2-hour education.
Yes, 100%. Very experienced.
All right, great.
Else?
Thanks so much, Tim. I'll put a link to the book in the Slack channel so you guys can reference it there as well. Let me share my screen. All right. So couple slides and we'll wrap up for today. So just our action items behind today's meeting. Obviously discuss what you're hearing today on the basis of your reimbursement needs with your client directors. Have a talk about your mentor, advisor, and board priorities, and if they've shifted with any of the input today. Obviously, we will continue to work on our pitch decks. And if you haven't already completed, make sure you update your company assessments with your client directors within the next week or so. So we want to kind of make sure we're mapping out our midpoints and seeing where we're at in terms of those. In terms of upcoming mastermind, we now kind of shift to a 3-week cycle on our mastermind. We'd like to ask everybody to prepare your ask worksheets and share it with your client director and the host of your session prior to your sessions. so that they can get them out to your peers. And remember that in the future, we may start to have some of your Pioneer Council members join in on your mastermind sessions. So we want to make sure they have these documents in advance to think about. So the Pioneer Council is looking really great. So these are would fall into our mentor category. As we've just discussed, we have for most teams, we have 5 to 6 folks that have volunteered to raise their hand, covering a number of bases in terms of entrepreneurs, academics, industry, investors, who all have a little passion to kind of give back and get involved. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to introduce those folks to each of the mastermind groups by the end of the week. I do know that we're now up to kind of 34 applications, with another 3 to 5 probably in the background waiting to sign up. So I'm really pleased with the quality of the applications. Some really great people looking to help us out, which is great. And as always, kind of check in on the Slack channel. We tend to put a lot of the resources there, and we're looking to kind of tag each of you relative to any investment or news of interests. And it's also a great place to ask, put your asks out beyond your mastermind groups to share with others. So we do take a break in our workshop content now, as we kind of go to structure our content and customize a bit. So the next workshop will be on Tuesday, October 8th, from 8:15 to 12:15. Still a lot going on in between now and then. We'll have our mastermind sessions. We'll have the Rocky Mountain Investor Conferences. You'll start to see some lunch and learns and fireside chats appear relative to some of the topics we've raised today. And so we'll be continuing to kind of pick up that investment kind of going forward. And as I mentioned, hopefully getting your Pioneer Council introductions out this week. So with that, unless there are any questions, I think we are good for today. Any
There's
final
some comments and questions in chat, Kevin.
all right, I can't, let me see. Let me stop sharing. I can't find my chat. There they are. Okay. Okay, a comment on the Pioneer Council. Yeah, I think you guys are going to be really pleased. This is a bit of a pilot with the Pioneer Council. It was to try and find some very highly fit for purpose mentors and expand your networks. And I think we have a good group of people who have raised that. Jessica's asking I may have missed an email. The Pioneer Councils are mentors for our cohort. The Pioneer Council will actually set up for each mastermind group. And so that's where we let them we gave them some background on everybody in each group. And they were able to raise their hand and say, these were the 1 to 2 groups I would like to preference. So everybody who will be in your Pioneer Council has preferenced your group. And then what we did is we kind of looked across the board of kind of where you're at, who are the members of the group, and kind of distributed those 1s and 2s to kind of balance out everybody and try and get to that profile that we look for. So like I said, it's a really impressive group. I think you guys are going to enjoy some of these connections. They will start in this 3rd quarter in kind of a lighter lift. Each Pioneer Council member is agreeing to participate in 1 of your mastermind sessions. So you can probably expect 1 to 2 of your Pioneer Council members in your meetings. They've review all of your asks from here on out for your mastermind sessions. They've agreed to provide all of you 30-minute virtual coffee, one-on-one. And they're going to do a pitch review. So we're actually going to use the Pioneer Council to review the pitches from all of the mastermind groups. And then they are going to end up selecting the 6 teams that'll get to be the key presenters at the graduation showcase. So playing a lot of roles. And then again, key opportunity there for you to get to see how different people provide advice to you as far as a mentorship without obligation, and an opportunity to extend your network and go further beyond there. So there's some pilot elements to this, is a little bit of a different approach, but we think it might be a really powerful approach to get you some really interesting folks in to give you some insights and share some connections. All right, if there are no other questions, then we are set for today. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
See you. Thank you.